My name is Renee Castillo. I'm 29, and for 18 months I watched my father slowly figure out that my mother had been living a second life, and I was the one who had to decide whether to tell him what I already knew. My parents, Frank and Dana Castillo, were the couple everyone in our neighborhood pointed to as proof that marriage could survive anything. 26 years together. My dad managed the parts counter at a truck dealership outside Fort Wayne, steady as a metronome, same route to work, same coffee mug, same seat at the same diner every Sunday after church. My mom taught third grade and ran the school's fall festival every year like it was a small war she intended to win. From the outside, nothing about our house ever looked like it was cracking. From the inside, it had been cracking for a long time. I just didn't understand what I was looking at until I was old enough to. I was 24, home for a weekend, when I first noticed my mother's phone habits had changed. She used to leave it face up on the kitchen counter, buzzing all day with parent emails and coupon alerts. That visit, it never left her hand. She'd step onto the back porch to answer calls, phone pressed close, voice dropped to a register I didn't recognize, softer, quicker, almost girlish. When she came back inside, she'd set the phone face down and ask me something ordinary, like whether I wanted more coffee, as if she were resetting a scene. I told myself it was nothing. Parents are allowed private lives. But 3 months later, driving home late from a friend's birthday dinner, I passed the parking lot of a boutique hotel 2 towns over and saw my mother's white Camry parked at the far edge, away from the lights. I didn't stop. I told myself it could have been anything, a colleague's retirement party, a book club that met somewhere strange. I wanted to believe that so badly I nearly convinced myself. I didn't say anything to my father. That's the part ones still carry. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I hadn't actually seen anything, that dragging a maybe into my parents' marriage wasn't my right. What I didn't admit to myself was that I was scared of what happens to a house once you pull one thread. Looking back, there were smaller signs even before that night, ones I'd filed away without connecting them. My mother had started buying new clothes she never wore around the house, nice blouses, the kind meant for someone to notice, hanging in her closet with tags still on for weeks before they disappeared, worn somewhere I never saw. She'd started going to the gym more, then stopped mentioning the gym entirely, as if she'd realized bringing it up too often invited questions. She laughed differently on the phone in those months, a lighter, quicker laugh I hadn't heard directed at my father in years. I told myself people are allowed to want to feel good about themselves. I told myself a lot of things that year to avoid looking directly at what was in front of me. His name was Curtis Vance. I learned that almost a year later, and only because my mother finally told me herself, sitting across from me at a coffee shop with her hands wrapped so tightly around her cup that her knuckles went white. They'd met at a continuing education conference for teachers 2 years earlier. He taught history at a district 40 minutes away, recently divorced, funny in the low-key way that sneaks up on you. What started as conference small talk turned into texting, then coffee as friends, then something neither of them called by its real name for a long time. My mother told me it wasn't about my father doing anything wrong. She said it almost apologetically, like she needed me to understand that this wasn't a story about being driven away, it was a story about being pulled towards something she hadn't let herself want in years. I didn't hate her for it in that moment. I want to be honest about that. What I hated was being handed the secret and expected to help carry it. She asked me not directly, but in the shape of everything she said, to keep quiet a little longer. To give her time to figure it out. I told her I wouldn't lie to my father if he asked me straight out, but I wouldn't go looking for a reason to break this to him either. That felt, at the time, like the only neutral ground I could stand on. Looking back, there is no neutral ground in a secret like that. There's just delay. I remember driving home from that coffee shop with both hands tied on the wheel, replaying every family dinner from the past 2 years, wondering how many of them my mother had sat through carrying this exact weight, smiling at my father across the table, passing him the potatoes, asking about his day, while a whole separate version of her life sat folded up behind her eyes. I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that a secret that size doesn't just belong to the person keeping it. It quietly reorganizes everyone around it, whether they know the shape of it or not. My father had been living inside a marriage that had already changed without his permission, and none of us who knew had given him the chance to decide whether he wanted to keep living inside it. What I didn't know then was that my father had already started noticing things on his own, quietly, the way a mechanic notices an engine running just slightly wrong before anyone else can hear it. He mentioned it to me almost sideways, months later, over a beer at his garage while he tinkered with an old radio he'd been fixing for years. He said my mother had started taking a pottery class on Thursday nights, except the community center had no record of any pottery class when he'd once tried to sign up for something else on the same night and called to ask about the schedule. He said she'd started deleting her call history, something she'd never done in 26 years of a phone sitting openly on the counter. He said she'd started smelling like a cologne that wasn't his. He didn't accuse her of anything out loud. My father is not a man who leads with accusations. He leads with quiet, methodical checking, the same way he'd diagnose a truck that wouldn't start. He began writing things down, dates, times, small inconsistencies, not because he wanted proof to use against her, he told me later, but because he needed to know whether he was losing his mind or whether something real was happening around him. He told me he'd lie awake some nights running through the math of it, the Thursday pottery class that didn't exist, the credit card statement with a coffee shop charge 2 towns over on a day my mother said she'd never left the school. A receipt for a hotel loyalty program crumpled in the bottom of her purse that he found by accident looking for a pen. Each piece on its own felt explainable. Stacked together, they stopped being coincidence and started being a pattern he couldn't unsee once he'd seen it. He said the worst part wasn't any single piece of evidence. It was the particular loneliness of suspecting something was wrong inside your own marriage and having no one to say it out loud to, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he wasn't ready for yet. I sat across from him that night at the garage, holding a beer I didn't drink, and I said nothing. That's the second silence I have to own. It came apart on a Tuesday in October, the kind of ordinary weeknight nobody remembers choosing to be historic. My mother told my father she had a school open house running late. My father, instead of accepting it the way he always had, drove past the school on his way home from a late parts delivery and saw the building dark, the parking lot empty except for the janitor's truck. He didn't call her. He didn't confront her from a phone booth like something out of a movie. He drove to the boutique hotel 2 towns over, the same one I'd once driven past without stopping, because 6 months earlier, going through the mail, he'd found a single loyalty program postcard addressed to her, thanking her for another wonderful stay, and he'd never been able to fully explain it away. He found her Camry parked at the far edge of the lot, away from the lights, exactly where I'd seen it a year before. He didn't go inside. He told me later he sat in his truck across the street for almost 40 minutes, engine off, hands on the wheel, trying to decide what kind of man he wanted to be when she walked out of that building. When she finally did, with Curtis, laughing at something, her hand briefly resting on his arm before she caught herself, my father didn't run at them. He didn't scream. He rolled his window down, called her name once, calmly, and watched her entire face collapse in the space of a single second. That's the moment my mother always describes as the end of the story she'd been telling herself. That she could hold 2 lives at once without either one touching the other. My father proved, without raising his voice, that it was never true. My mother came home that night in near silence, my father following at a careful distance in his own truck, as if giving her room to disappear into the dark if she needed to. She didn't. She came inside, sat at the kitchen table where she'd sat for 26 years of dinners, and waited for whatever was coming. What came wasn't a screaming match. My father is not a screamer. He sat down across from her, set his keys on the table with a small, deliberate click, and asked her one question. How long? Not who, not why, how long? I think he needed the shape of the timeline before he could face anything else. She told him almost 2 years. She told him about the conference, about the coffee that became something else, about the pottery class that never existed. She told him she was sorry, and she meant it, and being sorry didn't undo any of it, and she knew that too. My father didn't leave that night. He didn't leave the next night either. What he did instead surprised everyone who thought they understood him, including me. He asked her to move out of their bedroom into the guest room. Not as punishment, he said later, but because he needed physical space to think clearly. And he didn't trust himself to think clearly lying 6 inches from someone he no longer knew the way he thought he did. For 3 weeks, they lived in the same house like two people sharing a hallway they used to share a life in. My mother stopped seeing Curtis immediately. She told me that, and I believe her, because the man who'd once been careful and cologne started calling her repeatedly during those weeks, and she stopped answering, then blocked his number entirely. In front of my father, so he could see her do it. Those 3 weeks were the strangest stretch our family ever lived through. My mother kept teaching every day, kept grading papers at the kitchen table like nothing had changed, because she told me later that showing up normal for 8 hours a day was the only thing keeping her from falling apart entirely. My father kept going to the dealership, kept fixing trucks, kept coming home to a house that felt like a stranger's. I called both of them separately almost every night that October, my mother in a hushed voice from the guest room, my father from the garage with the radio playing static in the background, and I felt for the first time what it must be like to be a marriage counselor, holding two versions of the same story and trying not to let either one tip me over into taking a side I hadn't earned the right to take. It was during those 3 weeks that I finally told my father what I'd known and for how long. I drove out to the garage where he was fixing that same old radio, and I told him everything: the phone, the parking lot a year earlier, the coffee shop conversation with my mother, the promise I'd made to stay neutral. I expected him to be angry at me. He wasn't, not really. He set down his screwdriver and was quiet for a long time, and then he said something I've thought about every day since. Asterisk, you were protecting her, and I understand why. But silence protects the person keeping the secret, Renee. It never protects the person the secret is being kept from. Asterisk. That sentence rearranged something in me. I had told myself for over a year that staying quiet was the neutral choice, that it wasn't my secret to break. But there is no neutral choice inside somebody else's marriage once you're the one holding information the other person doesn't have. Silence is a choice too, and I had made it, and it had cost my father a year of confusion he didn't deserve and shouldn't have had to solve alone. I apologized to him that night in the garage, and he accepted it the way he accepts most things, quietly, without drama, filing it away as one more true thing about the people he loved that he now had to hold alongside everything else. My parents went to counseling starting that November, not because either of them was certain the marriage would survive it, but because 26 years felt like something that deserved one honest attempt before either of them decided to walk away for good. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Ilsa Pruitt, asked my mother a question early on that my mother repeated to me later because she couldn't stop turning it over. What were you actually looking for that you didn't think you could ask your husband for directly? My mother didn't have a clean answer. She talked around it for weeks in session after session, feeling invisible after 20 years of being somebody's mother and somebody's wife, before ever being asked what she wanted for herself, feeling like the version of her that Curtis saw, novel and interesting and undiscovered, was easier to fall into than the harder work of asking my father to see her that way again after 2.5 decades of routine. None of that made what she did right. She said that to me, more than once, almost fiercely, as if she needed me to know she wasn't building herself an excuse. But it gave the affair a shape that was sadder and more human than the version of it I'd been carrying, less a betrayal out of nowhere, more a slow erosion nobody had names for until it was already a canyon. My father, for his part, admitted things in counseling he'd never said to any of us. That he'd let the marriage run on autopilot for years, coasting on routine because routine felt safe. That he'd stopped asking my mother real questions somewhere around the time I left for college, mistaking a quiet house for a peaceful one. None of that excused what she'd done. He said that plainly more than once. But it meant the 6 months of reconstruction that followed weren't just about her earning back trust, they were about both of them relearning how to actually see each other instead of just occupying the same rooms. They didn't divorce, though for a long stretch of that winter, none of us, including them, would have bet on it. My father moved back into their bedroom in the spring, not as a grand romantic gesture, but quietly, the way he does everything, after a Sunday afternoon when my mother asked him directly, for what she said was the first time in years, what he actually wanted from the rest of his life. He told her the truth, that he wanted her, the real version, not the polished one who managed everyone's expectations, including his. Curtis moved out of the district the following school year. Whether that was coincidence or discomfort, none of us ever asked. My mother still teaches third grade. She still runs the fall festival, though she told me last year she's finally started saying no to committees she used to say yes to out of habit, just to feel needed by somebody. My father still fixes old radios in the garage on weeknights, but now my mother sometimes sits out there with him, not doing anything in particular. Just present in a way I don't think either of them made time for in the 15 years before any of this happened. I used to think loyalty meant staying quiet to protect the people you love from pain. I don't think that anymore. What I learned, watching my father sit across from my mother that Tuesday night and ask one calm question instead of exploding, and watching my mother finally answer a question about herself she'd been avoiding for 2 years, is that the people who love each other the most are the ones who can survive being fully seen, the good and the broken parts both. My father never once told me he wished he hadn't found out. Even in the worst weeks, when the guest room door stayed shut and neither of them would look at each other across the kitchen table, he said the not knowing had been worse than the knowing. At least once he knew, there was something solid to stand on, even if it was cracked. Secrets don't protect love. They just delay the moment love has to prove whether it's real. My mother, for her part, told me once that the hardest thing wasn't the affair ending, or even the counseling sessions where she had to say out loud all the small selfish reasons she'd let it start. The hardest thing was realizing that the version of herself Curtis had seen, interesting, undiscovered, worth chasing, had been sitting right there the whole time, waiting for someone at home to ask. I still think about that year I spent as the only person who knew both halves of the story, standing in the middle with a secret I told myself wasn't mine to break. If I could go back, I wouldn't wait a year. I'd tell my father the night I saw that Camry in the parking lot, even not knowing for certain what it meant. Because the truth, even half-formed, is kinder in the long run than the silence that lets someone keep guessing in the dark. My parents are still married. 28 years now. It isn't the marriage it was before, it's harder one than that, more honest, occasionally more fragile, but also, they both tell me, more real than the smooth 26 years that came before it ever were. Sometimes the biggest secret in a family isn't the affair itself. It's how long everyone around it agreed, without ever saying so out loud, to help keep it hidden.